Welcome, survivors, to the edge of the apocalypse, where every story is a fight to stay alive. Thanks from the bottom of my heart for every like, comment, and sub. Keep hitting that bell and join the fight with me. Thanks from the bottom of my heart.
The metallic tang of blood is different when it's fresh. It doesn't smell like the rusted pipes in the sub-basement or the copper pennies I used to find under the vending machines. It smells like heat, like a hot iron pressed against a wet rag. My breath hitched in my throat as I pressed my back against the cold tile of the supply closet, the plastic handles of my industrial mop digging into my spine. Outside that thin laminate door, something was wet slapping against the linoleum, dragging. The sound of a heavy coat being pulled through a puddle, but I knew it wasn't a coat. It was Jenkins, or what was left of him. 10 minutes ago, he'd been checking my badge at the Sector 4 checkpoint, complaining about his daughter's tuition. Now he was making a sound I'd only heard in slaughterhouses, a wet, gurgling huff that sounded like his lungs were full of gravel. My fingers trembled as I gripped the spray bottle of bleach. It was a pathetic weapon, but it was all I had. The CDC is a fortress of glass and steel, designed to keep the deadliest things on Earth in their cages, but it felt like a coffin now. The emergency lights pulsed a rhythmic, sickly red, turning the gap under the door into a blinking strobe of horror. Every time the light flashed, I saw a shadow pass, long, distorted, and jerky. It didn't walk, it twitched. The grinding noise of teeth on bone echoed through the ventilation shaft, a sound so dry and sharp it made my own molars ache. I remember thinking about the floor. I just waxed it. It was supposed to be a quiet Tuesday, just me, the buffing machine, and the humming of the deep freeze units. Then the sirens started, not the fire alarm, not the drill. The containment breach siren, a sound so low it vibrates in your marrow. It's the sound of the world ending from the inside out. I saw Dr. Aris run past the break room, her lab coat torn and soaked in something dark. She wasn't screaming. She was silent, her eyes wide and glassy, staring at nothing as she sprinted toward the high-security elevators. She didn't make it. The things that came out of the Level 4 lab were fast, faster than anything that should be dead. They didn't look like the zombies from the movies. They looked like people who had been turned inside out by a fever. Their skin was translucent, stretched so tight over their muscles that it looked like it would pop. And their eyes, they weren't white or red. They were just gone, dissolved into pits of black fluid. I watched through the window of the break room as one of them tackled Aris. It didn't bite her neck, it just tore. It used its fingers like claws, ripping into the soft tissue of her shoulder with a strength that defied physics. I didn't help. I couldn't. I just sank to the floor and crawled into this closet. And now Jenkins is outside. He knows I'm here. I can hear him sniffing, a sharp, frantic inhaling through a nose that I know is broken. The handle of the door jiggled, slow, methodical. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. If I died here, nobody would find me. I was just the guy who emptied the trash, the man who scrubbed the toilets while the geniuses played God with pathogens. I knew the secrets of the CDC, but not the scientific kind. I knew which floorboards creaked, which cameras had blind spots, and which doors didn't latch right. I knew that the ventilation in this wing was linked to the main hub. If the virus was airborne, I was already a ghost, but the way Jenkins was behaving, this wasn't airborne, this was predatory. The door groaned under a sudden weight. He wasn't turning the handle anymore. He was leaning, pushing. I could hear the wood splintering. I looked around the dark closet, a gallon of ammonia, a box of industrial wipes, a spare set of keys to the maintenance tunnels. The tunnels. They ran under the entire complex, connecting the labs to the power grid. If I could get to the hatch in the floor, I might have a chance. But the hatch was under the heavy shelving unit. I'd need to move it without making a sound. The red light flashed again. A pair of gray, blood-slicked fingers curled around the edge of the door frame. The laminate was snapping. I didn't have minutes. I had seconds. I lunged for the shelving unit, my muscles screaming as I pushed against the metal. It screeched, a high, piercing metal-on-tile sound that might as well have been a dinner bell. Outside, the scratching stopped. Then a roar. Not a human roar, but a sound of pure, unadulterated hunger. The door exploded inward. Jenkins, or the meat suit that used to be him, hurled himself into the small space. His jaw was hanging by a single tendon, his chest a cavern of exposed ribs. I didn't think. I swung the gallon of ammonia. It caught him square in the temple, the plastic bursting and drenching both of us in the stinging, acrid liquid. He recoiled, the chemical searing his ruined eyes, and I used that moment of hesitation to dive for the floor. The hatch was there. I yanked the ring. It was heavy, rusted shut from years of neglect, but adrenaline is a hell of a drug. It gave way just as Jenkins lunged again, his teeth snapping inches from my ankle. I tumbled into the dark, falling 5 feet into the cold, damp concrete of the maintenance crawlspace. I didn't wait to see if he followed. I ran. I ran through the dark, guided only by the dim, orange service lights that flickered every 50 feet. The air down here smelled like wet earth and ozone. It was a maze of pipes and wires, the veins of the monster that had just swallowed me whole. I could hear them above me. The facility was alive with the sound of the hunt. Thousands of footsteps, the crashing of glass, the occasional burst of gunfire that ended too quickly. They were everywhere. The elite security teams, the scientists with their high-clearance badges, none of it mattered. In the dark, we were all just meat. I found a junction box and slumped against it, my lungs burning. My hand went to my pocket, feeling the cold metal of my master key ring. I had access to every room in the building, every lab, every storage locker. To the world outside, I was a janitor. To the things upstairs, I was a snack. But to the CDC security system, I was a ghost with a key. I had to get to the surface. I had to tell someone. But as I looked at the monitors in the security substation I stumbled upon, my heart stopped. The exterior cameras weren't showing a lockdown. They were showing smoke. The city of Atlanta was orange. The fire wasn't just in the building. The world wasn't ending here. It had already ended while I was buffing the floors in Sector 4. The realization hit me harder than any blow. There was no rescue coming, no army, no evacuation. I was in the safest building on the planet, and it had become a tomb. I watched the screens, mesmerized by the carnage. On level 2, I saw a group of survivors huddled in the cafeteria. They had barricaded the doors with tables, but the things outside were relentless. They weren't just banging, they were piling up, using their bodies as ramps to reach the glass transoms above the doors. It was calculated, instinctual, a hive mind of hunger. One of the survivors, a young intern I'd seen 1,000 times, looked directly into the camera. His face was a mask of terror. He knew there was no way out. I turned away from the screen, unable to watch the end. I had to move. If I stayed here, they'd find the vents. They'd find the smell of my fear. I started walking deeper into the tunnels toward the backup generators. If I could cut the power, I might slow them down. I might confuse them, or I might just die in the dark. As I turned a corner, I saw it. A single white lab coat lying in the middle of the path. It was clean. No blood, no tears. I picked it up, the fabric feeling alien in my grease-stained hands. Inside the pocket was a notebook. Subject 0 observation log. My breath caught. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a spill. It was a study, and I was currently in the middle of the Petri dish. The notebook detailed the progression. The loss of higher brain function within 90 seconds. The extreme physical enhancement, the hunger. But there was one line underlined twice in red ink. The janitorial staff provides the perfect cover for cross-contamination. My blood ran cold. I wasn't just a survivor, I was a vector. I had been cleaning the labs where this thing was born. I had been touching the surfaces, breathing the air, and then walking into the break rooms, the offices, the locker rooms. I was the reason the CDC fell so fast. I looked at my hands. They were shaking. Not just from fear. There was a faint blue tint to my veins, a map of my own destruction. I wasn't turning yet, but the clock was ticking. I had to find a cure, or I had to find a way to burn this entire place to the ground before the infection spread past the gates. If I was the one who started it, I had to be the one who ended it. I gripped my mop handle, now a makeshift spear, and looked up at the ceiling. The sounds of the undead were getting louder. They were in the pipes now. I could hear them clicking. I wasn't just a janitor anymore. I was the last man standing in the heart of the apocalypse, and I had a lot of cleaning to do. My skin felt tight, a layer of parchment paper stretched over a furnace. Every heartbeat felt like a hammer blow against my ribs. I reached the manual override for the Sector 4 ventilation. If I could shut it down, I could stop the spread. But standing there, I realized I'd already carried it to the air filtration units during my 9 p.m. rounds. I was the angel of death in a blue jumpsuit. I remembered the way the floor buffer used to sound, a steady, hypnotic hum that made the night shifts pass like a dream. Now, the only sound is the rhythmic thud of my own failing heart. The CDC was supposed to be the safest place on Earth, a cathedral of science dedicated to the preservation of life. But standing here, in the shadow of the cooling towers, I realized it was always a tomb waiting for its occupants. I looked down at the city again through a service hatch. The fires were spreading, drawing patterns of orange across the grid of the streets. It looked like a circuit board burning out. I could feel the suppressor of my own immune system failing, the cold in my veins turning into a prickly electric heat. It felt like ants crawling under my skin, thousands of them marching toward my brain. I reached for the maintenance hatch on the ledge, my fingers fumbling with the latch. My coordination was going. I had to get inside. I had to find someone. Anyone. I found a researcher named Sarah slumped against a server rack in the comms wing, her face pale. She had done it. The data transmitted light was a steady, mocking green. She sent the genomic sequence of the virus to an off-site server. "It's done," she whispered. She looked at me, her eyes widening as she saw the state of my face. The black veins had reached my temples. "Arthur, you have to go." "I'm not going anywhere," I said, my voice a wet growl. We sat there in the dark, two ghosts in a dying world, watching the green light blink. The sirens in the distance were fading, replaced by a silence that was far more terrifying. It was the silence of a world that had finally stopped breathing. I closed my eyes and imagined the sound of my floor buffer, the hum of the lights, and the simple peace of a job well done. But the hunger was there, waiting in the dark. And for the first time in my life, I didn't want to clean up the mess. I wanted to add to it. The heartbeat was the first thing that truly changed. Sarah's heart wasn't just a sound anymore. It was a physical pressure against my eardrums, a frantic, fluttering bird trapped in a cage of ribs, radiating a heat that felt like a sun in the freezing dark of the comms wing. I could hear the blood rushing through her carotid artery, a thick, rhythmic pulse that made the back of my throat itch with a dry, dusty thirst that no water could quench. I looked at my hands in the flickering green glow of the server lights. My fingernails were turning a bruised, necrotic purple, and the black veins had mapped out a new geography across my skin, tracing the path of the rot as it claimed my nervous system. I tried to tell her to run. I tried to say her name, but my tongue felt like a piece of heavy, salted meat in my mouth. What came out was a low, vibrating rattle, a sound that belonged in a slaughterhouse, not a laboratory. Sarah flinched, her back pressing harder against the server rack, the metal groaning under her weight. She saw it then, the way my eyes didn't quite focus on her face anymore, but on the pulse in her neck. I saw her hand drift toward the scalpel she'd kept in her lab coat pocket, a tiny silver sliver of hope. I didn't blame her. I wanted her to use it. But the part of me that was Arthur, the man who liked his coffee black and his floors streak-free, was being pushed into a very small, very dark corner of my mind. I stood up and the world tilted. My joints didn't ache, they felt lubricated by something cold and viscous. The silence of the CDC was heavy, a suffocating shroud of sterile air and the faint, ozone smell of fried electronics. I turned away from her, the effort of resisting the urge to lunge making my muscles spasm. I walked toward the heavy reinforced door, my boots dragging on the linoleum. Every step was a battle. The floor was dirty. There was a smear of dried blood near the threshold, and for the first time in 20 years I didn't feel the impulse to reach for a rag. I felt a kinship with it. I pushed through the door into the corridor, leaving Sarah behind in the green-lit tomb. The hallway was a graveyard of emergency lights strobing in a slow, dying rhythm. Red, then shadow. Red, then shadow. In the flashes I saw them, my coworkers, or what was left of them. Dr. Aris was slumped against a water fountain, his throat torn open in a way that looked like a jagged red smile. He'd been a prick about the dust on his microscope slides, always leaving memos about contamination protocols. Now, he was the contamination. I walked past him and he didn't move. He was too far gone, or maybe he recognized the scent of the transition on me. We were the same brand of broken now. The hunger began to grow, moving from a needle prick in my brain to a roaring furnace in my chest. It wasn't just a need to eat. It was a need to consume the life I was losing. I reached the elevators, the stainless steel doors scarred by fingernail scratches. I didn't press the button. I knew the power was cycling, surging in fitful bursts as the backup generators choked on their own exhaust. I found the stairwell instead. The concrete stairs felt different under my feet, sharper, more defined. My senses were sharpening even as my mind was dulling. I could smell the grease in the cafeteria 3 floors up. I could smell the sour sweat of the security team huddled in the basement. I could smell the fear. It smelled like copper and vinegar, a sharp, acidic scent that made my jaw ache. I descended, not upward toward the exit, but downward toward the belly of the beast. The BSL-4 labs. If the world was ending, I wanted to see the heart of the fire. The air grew colder as I went deeper, the ventilation systems failing, leaving the atmosphere thick and stagnant. I passed a shattered glass partition where a group of researchers had tried to barricade themselves. They hadn't succeeded. The glass shards on the floor crunched under my boots, a sound like breaking teeth. I saw a hand clutching a keycard, severed at the wrist. I picked it up. My movements were jerky, like a marionette with tangled strings, but I held on to it. The janitor still had his keys. In the level 4 containment zone, the silence was absolute. This was the most secure place on Earth, a fortress designed to keep death in a bottle, and it had failed. The heavy vault doors were hissed open, their seals broken by some frantic hand during the initial panic. I walked into the main lab, the place where they'd been dissecting the first samples from the patient 0 in Seattle. The smell here was different. It wasn't rot. It was chemical, a sharp, medicinal tang that bit at my nose. On the central stainless steel table lay a body draped in a tattered blue shroud. I pulled the sheet back. It was a girl no older than 20, her skin a mosaic of those same black veins. Her eyes were open, milky and clouded, staring at the ceiling with an expression of eternal surprise. I touched her forehead. It was ice cold. I felt a strange sense of envy. She was finished with the transformation. She was at peace in her hunger. I heard a sound from the corner, a wet, slurping noise that didn't belong in a sterile environment. I turned, my neck cracking with a loud pop. It was Miller, the night shift security lead. He was hunched over something on the floor, his tactical vest torn, his shoulders heaving. He'd been a friend. We'd shared cigarettes out by the loading docks when the air was cool and the world made sense. Now he was tearing into the remains of a lab tech, his fingers buried deep in the cavity of the chest. He looked up at me, his face a mask of gore, his eyes glowing with a dull, predatory light. He didn't growl. He didn't attack. He just looked at me, a piece of gristle hanging from his lip, and for a second I saw a flicker of recognition. Then it was gone, replaced by the void. He went back to his meal, the sound of his chewing echoing off the tiled walls. I stood there watching him, and the hunger in me roared. I wanted to join him. I wanted to forget the name of my mother, the sound of the rain, the feeling of clean sheets. I wanted to disappear into the red. But the janitor was still there, clutching that key card. A reminder of a life spent keeping things in their place. I turned and left him to his feast, my footsteps heavy and deliberate. I made my way back to the service tunnels, the hidden arteries of the building that only the maintenance staff knew. These were my domains. The pipes, the valves, the buzzing transformers, they were the gods I'd served for years. I found the main breaker room, the walls lined with high-voltage panels. The red emergency lights were dimmer here, the shadows long and stretching like reaching fingers. I saw my reflection in the glass of a pressure gauge. I didn't recognize the man looking back. His skin was the color of wood smoke, his eyes 2 pits of black ink with a ring of gold around the iris. The black veins had reached his jawline now, pulsing with every slow, heavy thud of a heart that was forgetting how to beat. I reached out and touched the glass, my fingers leaving a greasy gray smear. I wanted to clean it. I reached for the rag in my belt loop, but my hand wouldn't obey. Instead, I balled my fist and smashed the gauge, the glass cutting deep into my knuckles. I didn't feel pain. I felt a dull vibration, a distant echo of an impact. The blood that leaked out wasn't red. It was dark, thick as motor oil, and it didn't flow so much as ooze. I followed the service tunnel toward the loading bays, the air becoming warmer, tainted by the smell of smoke and gasoline from the outside world. I could hear the city now. It wasn't the sound of traffic or sirens anymore. It was a low, rolling moan, a sound like a distant ocean hitting a jagged shore. It was the sound of a million voices screaming in a language that had no words. I reached the final security gate, the one that led to the surface. It was locked, the magnetic seals holding firm despite the power fluctuations. I took the keycard I'd found and swiped it. The reader chirped, a high, cheerful sound that felt like a joke. The heavy steel door hummed and slid back, revealing the loading dock and the world beyond. The sky over Atlanta was a bruised purple, choked with the smoke of 1,000 fires. The city skyline, once a beacon of glass and steel, was a jagged silhouette of ruins, the lights flickering out one by one like dying stars. Below the dock, the parking lot was a graveyard of abandoned cars, their doors flung open, their interiors stained with the evidence of a desperate exodus. And then there were the people, hundreds of them, moving in a slow, aimless tide across the asphalt. They didn't look like monsters from this distance. They looked like commuters waiting for a bus that was never coming. But I knew better. I could smell the collective hunger of them, a wall of heat and desperation that rolled over me like a wave. I stepped out onto the concrete platform, the night air hitting my face. It should have felt cold, but I felt nothing. The wind carried the scent of charred rubber, rotting peaches, and the sweet, cloying smell of unburied bodies. I saw a movement near the edge of the dock. A group of survivors, actual living people, were trying to hotwire a delivery truck. There were 4 of them, a man in a torn suit, 2 women clutching backpacks, and a child, a small boy who was staring up at the CDC building with wide, hollow eyes. They hadn't seen me yet. The man was cursing, his hands shaking as he fumbled with the wires under the steering column. One of the women was sobbing, a soft, rhythmic sound that cut through the low moan of the city. My vision began to tunnel, the boy's neck, the soft, pulsing heat of his life. It was all I could see. The hunger wasn't a roar anymore, it was a command. My legs moved without my consent, carrying me toward the edge of the dock, my movements fluid and predatory. The man looked up then. He saw me, a tall, gray figure in a janitor's uniform, covered in black veins and moving with a terrifying, unnatural grace. He didn't scream. He just froze, the wires sparking in his hand. "Arthur," a voice called out from behind me. I stopped. I turned my head, the movement slow and mechanical. It was Sarah. She had followed me. She was standing in the doorway of the loading bay, her face white, her eyes streaming with tears. She held a handgun in her hands, the weight of it clearly too much for her, the barrel wavering as she pointed it at my chest. She looked at the survivors, then back at me. She saw the hunger in my eyes, the way I was crouched, ready to spring. She saw that the man she'd shared coffee with in the break room was gone. "Don't do it, Arthur," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Don't be part of the mess." I looked at the boy by the truck. He was looking at me now, not with fear, but with a strange, numb curiosity. I looked at Sarah. I looked at my hands, the hands that had scrubbed floors, changed light bulbs, and fixed leaking faucets for 20 years. I had spent my life maintaining order in a world that didn't care. I had been the barrier between the dirt and the clean, the chaos and the structure. And now the barrier was gone. The world was dirty. The world was broken. And I was the thing that lived in the cracks. The growl started deep in my chest, a vibration that shook my entire frame. I felt the last of Arthur, the coffee, the floors, the simple peace, dissolve into the black oil of the virus. I didn't want to be a janitor anymore. I didn't want to fix anything. The boy's heartbeat was a drum calling me home. I took a step toward the edge of the dock, my muscles coiling like springs. Sarah's finger tightened on the trigger. I saw the muzzle flash before I heard the report. The bullet hit me in the shoulder, a blunt force that knocked me back but didn't hurt. It felt like a pat on the back, a goodbye from a world I no longer belonged to. I didn't fall. I just turned back to her, my jaw unhinging, my throat opening to let out a sound that wasn't a growl but a greeting. She fired again, the bullet grazing my temple, tearing away a flap of gray skin. I didn't stop. I leaped from the dock, but I didn't go for the boy. I ran toward the fence, toward the hundreds of them shuffling in the dark. I didn't want the small lives, I wanted the collective. I wanted to be part of the tide. I hit the chain link fence with enough force to warp the metal, climbing over it with a strength I'd never possessed in life. I dropped into the mass of the dead, and they didn't tear me apart. They parted for me, a sea of gray and black, welcoming their newest brother. I turned back one last time to look at the CDC. The building was a tomb, a monument to a civilization that thought it could control the uncontrollable. Sarah was still standing on the dock, a small, fragile light in the encroaching dark. I hope she made it. I hope she found a way to use that genomic sequence. But as I turned and merged with the crowd, moving toward the burning heart of Atlanta, I knew it didn't matter. The mess was too big now. The spill was everywhere. And as the hunger finally took the last of my thoughts, I realized I had a new job. I wasn't here to clean the world. I was here to finish it. We moved as one, a slow, unstoppable river of flesh and bone. The sounds of the city, the explosions, the screams, the crashing of glass began to fade, replaced by the unified moan of the horde. It was a beautiful sound in its own way. It was the sound of a world that had finally stopped trying to be anything other than what it was, a feast. I felt a sense of purpose I'd never known. No more schedules, no more waste bins, no more bleach, just the hunt, just the hunger, just the endless dark night. I looked up at the moon, which was orange and bloated behind the smoke, and for the first time since the black veins appeared, I felt a twisted version of that job well done feeling. The floors were finally going to stay dirty. The lights were finally going to stay out. And I would be there to make sure of it, a ghost in a uniform, wandering the ruins of a world I'd spent my life trying to keep spotless, finally happy to let the dust settle. The asphalt was warm beneath my feet, a stark contrast to the refrigerated linoleum of the CDC's Level 4 containment wings. It had been hours, maybe days. Time had become a viscous, pooling thing, since I had stepped out of the sterile prison of the labs and into the screaming embrace of Atlanta. I wasn't walking, I was flowing. We were a tide, a singular, pulsing muscle of hunger and decay, and I was a vital cell within it. My blue janitor's coveralls, once crisp and smelling of industrial-grade lavender, were now a map of the world's end, stained with the black ichor of the virus, the bright arterial spray of those who tried to run, and the gray soot of a city that was burning itself down to the bone. I could feel the collective consciousness of the horde humming in the base of my skull, a low-frequency vibration that replaced the lonely silence of my midnight shifts. It was the ultimate intercom system, and the message was always the same: forward, consume, erase. We reached the outskirts of the downtown district, where the skyscrapers leaned over us like tombstones waiting to fall. The smell was incredible, not the rot I would have expected as a living man, but a rich, complex perfume of iron, salt, and pheromones. I could track the living by the heat they radiated, little flickering candles of desperation, huddling behind boarded-up windows and inside stalled cars. To my old eyes, they would have been survivors. To my new eyes, they were just spills that needed to be mopped up. We encountered the first real resistance at the Peachtree intersection. It wasn't the scattered police fire we'd bypassed earlier. It was a military blockade. Humvees were lined up in a jagged arc, their mounted M2S spitting tongues of fire that tore through the front ranks of our collective body. I watched as the entities ahead of me, men and women I might have passed on the subway, were shredded into wet confetti. A head bounced near my boots, the eyes still blinking, the black veins writhing like trapped worms under the skin. I didn't feel fear. Fear is a luxury of the individual, and I was no longer an individual. I was the mop, and the floor was covered in the filth of the living. I felt the horde pivot, a massive, instinctive redirection of force. We didn't retreat. We flooded the alleys, moving through the narrow veins of the city to outflank the steel and fire. I found myself leading a smaller splinter group, perhaps 50 of us, through the back service entrance of a luxury hotel. The irony wasn't lost on me. I knew these layouts. I knew where the service elevators were, where the crawl spaces hid, where the structural weaknesses lived. I wasn't just a monster. I was a monster with a master key. Inside the hotel, the air was stagnant and smelled of expensive perfume and terrified sweat. We moved through the lobby, our footfalls a wet, rhythmic slapping against the marble. A security guard, a kid no older than 20, stood behind the concierge desk, his hands shaking so violently he could barely hold his shotgun. I saw the way his eyes tracked me. The man in the CDC uniform, the man who should have been a savior. I didn't snarl. I didn't scream. I just kept my steady, rhythmic pace. When he finally fired, the buckshot caught me in the shoulder, spinning me around and tearing away a chunk of my trapezius. I felt the impact, a dull thud like a heavy book dropping on a carpet, but the pain was distant, an echo of a language I no longer spoke. I turned back to him, the black fluid leaking from my wound, and I saw the exact moment his soul broke. It was a beautiful, clean break. I reached him before he could pump the slide again. My hands, calloused from years of gripping broom handles and floor buffers, found his throat. It was the most intimate thing I'd ever done. As the life left him, I felt a surge of that old professional pride. Another surface cleaned, another mess neutralized. But the job well done feeling was cut short by a sound that didn't belong to the horde or the dying city. A high-pitched, rhythmic chirping. I looked down at the guard's belt and saw a radio, but it wasn't his. It was a specialized, encrypted unit clipped to his tactical vest. A voice crackled through the static, a voice I recognized with a jolt of cold, sharp clarity that pierced through the viral fog in my brain. Arthur, Arthur, if you can hear this, if there's anything left of you, you need to listen. It was Dr. Aris Thorne, the lead virologist, the man who had stayed behind in the secure bunker beneath the CDC while I was out in the labs, the man who had given me my final instructions before the containment failed. He wasn't just a boss. He was the only person who had ever treated me like a human being instead of a piece of the furniture. He'd shared his coffee with me. He'd talked to me about his daughter's piano recitals. Arthur, the radio bled, Thorne's voice cracking with a desperation that tasted like copper in my mouth. The strain you have, it's not the baseline. We didn't tell you the whole truth. You were the control group, Arthur. We injected the janitor protocols into your specific batch of the vector. We needed a shepherd, someone to organize the chaos so we could study the saturation patterns from the bunker. You're not a ghost, Arthur. You're a tool. And I'm so sorry, but the cleanup has to be absolute. I've triggered the thermobaric failsafe for the district. The CDC isn't coming to save the world, Arthur. We're here to burn the evidence, including you. The betrayal hit harder than the shotgun blast. It wasn't just the threat of death. It was the realization that even in my rebirth, even in this new, dark purpose, I was still just a janitor. I was being used to sweep the room before they burned the building down. The collective moan of the horde around me shifted, sensing my sudden spike of internal friction. They looked at me with their milky, lidless eyes, waiting for the shepherd to lead. I looked at the radio, then up at the ceiling, imagining Thorne safe and warm behind 3 feet of reinforced concrete and lead shielding, watching me on a monitor like a lab rat in a maze. He had lied to me. He had let me believe I was the end of the world, when I was really just the distraction. I felt a new kind of hunger then. It wasn't the hunger for flesh or the hunger for the hunt. It was the hunger for a very specific kind of stain. I turned away from the dead guard and looked toward the north, where the CDC's monolith stood against the orange sky. The horde felt my shift in intent. The vibration in my skull intensified, turning from a hum to a roar. We weren't going to clean the city anymore. We were going to clean the house. I began to run. It wasn't the lumbering gait of the dead. It was the focused, driven sprint of a man who had a shift to finish and a boss to see. Behind me, the city began to scream in a different key. A low, whistling sound grew in the air, the sound of the failsafe Thorne had promised. The first of the missiles struck 3 blocks away, a white-hot bloom of pressure that vaporized the rear half of the horde in a fraction of a second. The shockwave threw me through the hotel's plate glass window, the shards slicing through my skin like diamonds. I landed on the sidewalk, my legs twisted, my CDC uniform charred and melting into my flesh. I hauled myself up, my bones grinding against each other with a sound like gravel in a blender. Around me, the world was turning into a furnace. The thermobarics were stripping the oxygen from the air, creating a vacuum that pulled the fire into swirling tornadoes of heat. My brothers and sisters, the ones I had marched with, were being reduced to ash before they could even scream. I saw a mother and child, both turned, standing hand in hand as the fire wind took them, turning them into a spray of gray carbon. The loss was profound. It was the loss of the only family I had ever truly belonged to. I was the last one left in the kill zone, the shepherd of a dead flock. I looked at my hands. The black veins were glowing now, reacting to the extreme heat, pulsating with a frantic, desperate rhythm. I wasn't dying. The janitor protocol Thorne had mentioned was working overtime, knitting my shredded tissues back together with a violent, agonizing speed. He had made me too well. He had made a tool that couldn't be broken, and now that tool was coming for him. I moved through the fire, my footsteps leaving charred prints on the melting asphalt. The city was a ruin, a blackened skeleton of its former self, but I didn't care about the floors anymore. I didn't care about the dust. I reached the perimeter of the CDC campus just as the second wave of missiles hit the downtown core. The sky turned a blinding, absolute white. I didn't blink. I couldn't. I watched the shockwave flatten the trees, the fences, the guard shacks. I was tossed like a rag doll, slamming into the reinforced concrete wall of the main entrance. I felt my ribs snap, felt a lung collapse, felt the cold air of the void pressing in on me. But the virus was angry now. It surged through me, a dark tide of repair, forcing my heart to beat, forcing my legs to move. I stood up in the smoking crater of the entrance. The heavy blast doors were warped but held shut. Thorn was behind them. He was watching. He thought he was safe in his clean, sterile world. I leaned my forehead against the cold steel of the door. I could hear them inside, not the dead, the living. I could hear the hum of the air filtration systems, the beep of the monitors, the frantic tapping of keys. And I could hear Thorn's voice filtered through an external speaker near the door. "Arthur, you're still there? How? The thermal yield should have. Nothing can survive that." I didn't answer. I didn't have the lungs for it. Instead, I reached into the pocket of my melted coveralls and pulled out the one thing I had kept from my old life, a heavy ring of keys. They were blackened and fused together by the heat, but the master override was still there, a jagged piece of steel that had opened every door in this building for 20 years. I didn't need the key to work the lock. I needed it to remember who I was. I wasn't a monster. I wasn't a shepherd. I was the man who cleaned up the messes. I began to pound on the door, not with the mindless rhythm of a zombie, but with a steady, measured beat. Thump, 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 the sound of a heartbeat, the sound of a deadline. I felt the virus within me beginning to change again, adapting to the trauma, to the betrayal. My fingernails lengthened, turning into jagged claws of hardened keratin infused with the very minerals of the concrete I was standing on. I began to dig. I wasn't trying to break the door. I was trying to unmake it. I peeled back the first layer of steel like it was wet cardboard, my fingers screaming as the metal sliced into my tendons, only for the virus to weld the wounds shut instantly. Thorn's voice was no longer clinical, it was hysterical. "Seal the inner bulkheads, vent the gas, he's coming through the structural seal. Arthur, stop. You're part of the solution. You're the reason the next world will be clean." Clean, the word tasted like ash. I finally ripped a hole large enough to see through. On the other side was the decontaminated transition chamber. It was bright. It was white. It was perfect. And then I saw Thorn. He was standing behind a secondary glass partition, his face pale, his eyes wide with a terror that no vaccine could cure. He looked at me, this scorched, skeletal thing in a ruined uniform, and he saw the consequence of his protocols. I pushed myself through the jagged hole, my flesh tearing and regenerating in a horrific cycle of growth and destruction. I fell onto the pristine white floor of the chamber, leaving a thick black smear of filth behind me. I looked up at the ceiling, at the automated disinfectant sprayers. They triggered, drenching me in high-concentration bleach. In the old world, it would have blinded me. Now it just felt like a mild irritant, a reminder of the life I'd wasted trying to keep things bright. I stood up, my body smoking from the chemical reaction, and walked toward the glass. Thorn backed away, tripping over a chair, his hands held out as if to ward off a ghost. I placed my hand on the glass. The black veins in my palm throbbed, spreading across the transparent surface like a frost made of ink. The glass began to spiderweb. It was reinforced, bulletproof, designed to withstand a laboratory explosion. But it wasn't designed for me. I wasn't a force of nature. I was a force of habit. And I had a habit of finishing what I started. "Arthur, please," Thorn whispered, his voice coming through the inner comms. "We can fix this. I can reverse it. I have the sequence. You can be whole again. I looked at my reflection in the cracking glass. I saw the ghost in the uniform. I saw the man who had spent his life in the shadows so the doctors could walk in the light. I didn't want to be whole. Being whole meant being a tool. Being whole meant being the one who gets swept away when the job is done. I didn't want to be the janitor anymore. I wanted to be the mess. With a final, explosive surge of strength, I threw my weight against the glass. It didn't shatter. It disintegrated into a million crystalline teeth. I stepped over the threshold into the inner sanctum. The air was pressurized, pushing against me, trying to keep the outside world out. But I was the outside world now. I walked toward Thorn, who was backed into a corner, clutching a vial of clear liquid. The cure, the sequence, the reset button. He held it out like a holy relic. "Stay back, I'll break it, you'll never be human again." I reached out and took his wrist. His bones felt like dry straw in my grip. I didn't take the vial, I didn't want it. I slowly closed my hand, crushing his wrist until the vial fell and shattered on the floor, the sequence mixing with the blood and the filth on my boots. I leaned in close to his ear, my breath a cold wind of decay. I didn't have a voice, but the collective roar in my head found a way to manifest, a vibration that rattled his very teeth. The floors, I thought, the message broadcasting directly into his panicked mind. The floors are finally going to stay dirty. I didn't kill him quickly. That wouldn't have been professional. I started with the things that made him clean. I tore away his lab coat, his lanyard, his polished shoes. I made him look like the rest of us. And as the sirens began to wail, signaling the final self-destruct of the entire CDC complex, I sat down on the floor next to him. I watched the black veins begin to creep up his neck, watched his eyes turn that beautiful, milky white. I wasn't alone anymore. I had a partner for the final shift. Outside, the world was a funeral pyre, but in here, in the heart of the machine, the dust was finally settling. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel the urge to sweep it up. I just sat there in the dark, a ghost in a uniform, waiting for the fire to turn us both into the same beautiful, permanent stain. The sirens were no longer sounds. They were textures, thick and jagged like serrated blades cutting through the pressurized air of the subterranean complex. I watched the doctor, Dr. Aris Thorn, the man who used to look through me as if I were made of the same transparent glass as his centrifuge vials, twitch on the linoleum. His transformation was a slow, agonizing masterpiece of biological restructuring. I stayed close, my hand resting almost tenderly on the cold tiles beside him, feeling the rumble of the deep earth thermite charges arming themselves beneath our feet. The CDC was designed to bury its secrets under 10,000 degrees of artificial sun, a final cleansing that even my strongest industrial bleaches could never achieve. I found a strange, perverse comfort in that. All my life, I had been the one to fight the encroachment of the world's grit, but now the world was coming to help me. The heat was already beginning to rise, a shimmering ghost dancing in the hallway, distorting the rows of heavy steel doors and the flickering fluorescent tubes that buzzed like dying insects. Thorn's fingers scraped against the floor, his fingernails, once manicured and clean, splitting and weeping a dark, viscous fluid that stained the pristine white surface. I didn't reach for my mop. I didn't reach for the spray bottle of Vercanes. I just watched. I reached out and touched the spreading stain, dragging my own thumb through it, feeling the warmth of his dissolving humanity. It felt like velvet. It felt like the truth. The intercom crackled one last time, a pre-recorded voice, calm and feminine, announcing the 3-minute countdown to total atmospheric remediation. It was such a beautiful, sterile word for being incinerated. Remediation. As if we were just a budget error being corrected, a smudge on a spreadsheet being rubbed out by a cosmic thumb. Thorne's eyes finally snapped open, and they weren't his anymore. The iris had bled into the white, a cloudy, necrotic nebula that held no recognition of the labs, the Nobel Prizes, or the years he'd spent trying to play God with a microscope. He looked at me, and for the first time in 10 years of working in the same hallway, he truly saw me. We were equals now. Two shapes in the dark, two stains waiting to be bleached by the coming fire. He didn't growl. He didn't lunge. He simply exhaled a wet, rattling sound, the sound of a lung filled with the black ink of the end, and leaned his head back against the wall. I leaned back too. The wall was hot now, the insulation failing as the facility's cooling systems were systematically shut down by the fail-safe protocols. Through the thick, reinforced windows of the observation deck, I could see the monitors of the central hub flickering with feeds from the world outside. It was a mosaic of fire. Atlanta was a glowing coal. The highways were long, winding snakes of abandoned steel and charred bone. The great out there that I had always cleaned up after was finally, irrevocably, beyond repair. I thought about the millions of trash bags I had hauled out of this building over the decades. I thought about the discarded coffee cups, the shredded memos, the biohazard bins filled with the hubris of men who thought they could contain the chaos of the universe with a pair of latex gloves. I felt a laugh bubbling up in my chest, a dry, hacking sound that harmonized with the sirens. I had been the guardian of their order, the silent priest of their cleanliness, and all the while, the very thing they feared was already inside me. Not the virus, not yet, but the exhaustion, the bone-deep weariness of a man who realized that the dirt always wins. You sweep a floor, and the moment you lift the broom, the skin cells of the living and the dust of the dead begin to settle again. It is a war of attrition that the janitor always loses. But now, as the temperature in the hallway rose to a blistering 120 degrees, I realized I was finally winning. The fire wouldn't just clean the floor, it would remove the floor. It would remove the building. It would remove the memory of the man who swept it. Thorne reached out a hand, his movements jerky and uncoordinated, and gripped my forearm. His grip was inhumanly strong, the strength of a machine with its limiters removed. His skin was gray, the color of wet ash, and I could feel the heat radiating from his core, the virus working like a furnace, keeping the meat moving even as the soul evaporated. I didn't pull away. I leaned into him. We were the only two living, or semi-living, things left in the heart of the machine. Above us, I could hear the structural steel of the CDC groaning, the sound of a great beast realizing it was about to die. The clean rooms, the level 4 containment zones where they kept the smallpox and the Ebola and the 1,000 variations of death, were being flooded with pressurized nitrogen and then ignited. I could imagine the vials shattering, the microscopic terrors being consumed by the same heat that was now blistering the paint on the walls around us. It was a symphony of destruction, and I was the only one left to hear the final movement. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my heavy ring of keys, keys to the supply closets, keys to the morgue, keys to the break room where the milk was surely curdling in the dead refrigerators. I dropped them. They hit the floor with a sharp, metallic clatter that seemed to echo forever in the hollowed-out silence between the siren blasts. I didn't need them anymore. There were no more doors to lock. No more secrets to keep. The air was becoming a soup of toxic fumes and shimmering heat waves. My lungs burned with every breath, a searing reminder that I was still made of carbon and water, still a biological entity subject to the laws of physics. Thorne's grip tightened, his milk-white eyes fixed on the ceiling as if he could see through the layers of concrete and lead, all the way up to the burning sky. I wondered if he was thinking about his formulas, or if he was simply experiencing the raw, wordless hunger of the swarm. I chose to believe he was at peace. We were the custodians of the end. Outside, the world was screaming, a chaotic mess of blood and teeth, but here in the epicenter of the collapse there was a strange, terrifying stillness. The darkness wasn't just the absence of light. It was a physical presence, a heavy velvet blanket that was slowly being pulled over our heads. I closed my eyes for a moment and saw the world as it would be tomorrow, a vast, unswept wilderness. The forests would creep over the ruins of the shopping malls. The vines would strangle the skyscrapers. The dust would settle on the monuments of man and stay there, undisturbed, forever. No one would be there to wipe the windows. No one would be there to buff the marble. The earth would finally be allowed to be dirty, and in that dirt there would be a different kind of life. A low, guttural vibration started deep in the earth, a sound that felt like the planet itself was clearing its throat. The thermite was blowing. The floors beneath us began to liquefy, the heavy slabs of reinforced concrete buckling like wet cardboard. I felt a sudden, sharp pain in my chest as the oxygen was sucked out of the hallway, fed into the ravenous maw of the firestorm approaching from the lower levels. I turned to Thorn, his face a mask of necrotic ruin, and I smiled. It was a real smile, the first one I'd felt in years. It wasn't the polite, invisible smile of a service worker. It was the grin of a man who had seen the punchline of the world's longest joke. We were the ultimate stain, the one that the CDC couldn't scrub away without destroying itself. The fire reached the end of the corridor, a wall of blinding, brilliant white that erased the shadows and the blood and the peeling paint. It was beautiful. It was the most professional cleaning job I had ever seen. The heat hit us like a solid object, a hammer made of sun. In that final microsecond, the distinction between the janitor and the doctor, the infected and the immune, the floor and the wall, simply vanished. The molecules that made up my uniform, the polyester blend I had washed 1,000 times, melted into the molecules of Thorn's expensive lab coat. Our DNA, the blueprints of our disparate lives, shattered and fused in the white-hot intensity of the remediation. I felt the sensation of falling, not downward into a pit, but outward into everything. I was the smoke rising from the ruins of Atlanta. I was the ash settling on the leaves of the Georgia pines. I was the grit in the wind that would eventually blind the eyes of the monsters roaming the streets. There was no more night shift. There was no more clocking out. The CDC collapsed in on itself, a signature of fire written across the subterranean dark, and the earth heaved a sigh of relief as the concrete tomb sealed shut. Above, the stars were hidden by the smoke of 1,000,000,000 burning dreams, but it didn't matter. The silence was absolute. The work was done. The floors were finally, perfectly, permanently dirty, and I was a part of that beautiful, sprawling mess. I was no longer the man who swept the world. I was the world itself, reclaimed by the chaos, dissolved into the ash, waiting for the wind to carry me wherever the new, broken world needed to go. The ghost in the uniform was gone, replaced by the purity of the flame, and as the last echoes of the CDC's destruction faded into the red Georgia clay, there was only the peace of the stain, the one thing that survives when everything else is washed away. The fire had turned us into the same beautiful, permanent stain, a shadow burned into the bedrock, a testament to the fact that we were here, and that at the very end we finally stopped trying to hide the mess. We just became it. The shift was over. The lights were out. And for the first time, the janitor slept, while the world outside began its long, slow, and glorious decay into the wild.